Welcome to Antonio Ruiz. This is the 1619 Project podcast with my friend Thomas Fields.
Hello, Antonio.
So we're going to try to something a little different today. We're going to try to see if we can stick two chapters in one show. And we're going to begin with chapter 13, Church. And there's so much I could say about this, but I love how they began with the story about Reverend Jeremiah Wright and 2008 and the furor that he created. Well, let me take that back. He didn't create the furor. The Republicans and the media created the furor. When he talked about, the sermon, they broadcast the sermon, "Goddamn America," and creating it did create a furor for Senator Barack Obama at that time, who was, of course, running to be the first Black president. And what I thought was interesting and when you read this chapter, there's a lot of background because Reverend Wright is part of a branch of the Black church that I guess the comparison would be in the Catholic Church, liberation theology.
Right.
Where there's no hesitation talking about the plight of Black people in America in the context of slavery, in the context of how white churches, particularly Pentecostal churches, white Christian churches, I take that back, white Christian churches use the Bible as justification for slavery. And so when you see it in that context, you begin to understand where Reverend Wright was coming from. But unfortunately, how do I say this in a nice way? Obama caved and basically handed the victory to the media by, giving his famous "A More Perfect Union" speech without any explanation. And not that the media did a good job in trying to understand where Reverend Wright was coming from. So before we talk about Obama's response to More Perfect Union, let's talk a little bit more about Reverend Wright and that part of the Black church and the idea of, I don't know, how would you describe it? It's not described here as, like I said, in the Catholic Church, it's described as liberation theology. How would you describe it in the Black church?
Well, there is, and near the end of this chapter, there's something very interesting, which comes from Reverend Cone.
Oh, yes.
And who was a young Black theologian. His full name was James Cone. And he put forth his theological theory, which was called Black theology.
Right, Black liberation theology, right.
Yes,
right.
in fact, his first book was Black Theology and Black Power. And putting those two together, that's pretty explosive for a lot of people to come to terms with. But that's essentially the counterside or the counterpart to what you were talking about, the Catholic Church.
Right.
I think what often gets overlooked when you talk about Black churches is how conservative most Black churches are. They're quite conservative. I grew up in one, extraordinarily conservative. There is also a wing of it, which, thank God, there's a wing of it that is, one could say, is more progressive. Ebenezer Baptist Church, which King came out of as an example of that. But I will tell you, my church was on the other side of that extreme. My church actually believed that segregation was probably good. And if you go through that thinking and that thinking process, you kind of see it from their perspective. Segregation from their viewpoints meant that Black churches held sway, and that when people were segregated, they came to the church for all of their needs, not just spiritual, but physical and all of that. And the church has lost a bit of power when people like King started preaching, go out and, rally for your vote, go out and integrate. That gets lost a lot, that there were people who believed that segregation was good. And not just in the Black church. I knew people who were store owners, who
business people, yes,
and they lost business because when Black could go to the white supermarket, they saw that as basically eroding their economic power. So we got to keep that in mind when we talk about churches. They can't be painted with the same brush.
Right. One of the things that I'm going to just kind of jump ahead. We'll jump over Obama's speech for a second. But one of the things when you're talking about James Cone, who was a mentor to Wright, he argued that the plight of Black Americans must be a central concern of the church. He criticized white Christians for what he saw as their historical failure to fight against slavery, violence, and racial oppression. That failure, he argued, had proved their tradition to be an unrighteous one, out of step with the essence of the gospel. And I just, I've known, well, you grew up in a Black church, but I've known Black ministers over the years, and it was really interesting. One particular one who was an old friend of my wife's, pretty, I've been to his church, pretty, I guess typical Black church in the sense that it was, I wouldn't call it conservative, but it wasn't definitely not Black liberation theology. But there was peppered in there things like, about taking control of your life, contributing to the community. So it was sort of Black power on the low side, it wasn't like an obvious thing, but it wasn't Black liberation theology. But in private, some of the discussions that I was part of, and that really educated me was, this idea that, some people would call it conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories rooted in historical fact. That the reality is that you could not trust white churches, that you could not trust white supremacist, white institutions to look out for the interests of Black people. And I'm not talking about 100 years ago. I'm talking about like today. So there's a lot there that this idea of challenging, as the book describes, that Black preachers in America have used their pulpits just like Wright did, to challenge the hypocrisy of white America's racism, sometimes with very harsh language. What's been your experience when you've come across preachers who talk like that, who preach like that?
This whole thing, it's like the dual lives. And I think W. Du Bois explained it, yes. Dual lives. It's, and as I pointed out earlier about my belonging to a Black church that believed segregation was a good thing for those Black churches, at the same time, they did note that white churches were not in keeping with God and Jesus' teaching. They had their own experiences with that, going back to when the enslaved people were allowed to worship in those churches. They were in segregated areas, and then when they got to be a little too populous, they were kicked out, and which is how a lot of these churches began. That's why a lot of these African Methodist churches, right, particularly Methodist churches, they're well aware of that. Of the hypocrisy that is coming from white churches, since I've stated before. And I'm not the first to say this, the most segregated hour in America is on Sunday morning. And they're quite aware of that. Yeah. But there is also because the Bible was used to justify slavery. And more importantly, the Bible can be used basically, depending on how you want to interpret it, You can interpret it in so many ways. White supremacists interpret it that it is a Bible is for only whites, and they can interpret the justification of slavery, and they have. If you want to, you can also interpret as being a book that tells you about you should rebel against slavery. So it's all about interpretation. There's nothing in the Bible that really comes out and says basically directly that slavery is bad or slavery is good. It's just the same thing with homosexuality. The Christian right will use certain passages say that homosexuality is proven to be bad. There's no passage that says that in the Bible. They also talk about the unborn, the sanctity of life, how the scriptures say it. There's nowhere in the Bible that says anything about that. Okay, but again, one can use the vagueness of the Bible to feed into your own philosophy, your own psychology, your own politics.
Yeah, I want to return to Obama's speech in response to, because I remembered not only the furor, but I remember the speech, and I remember, wow, the response from many of my Black friends to that speech, the speech, A More Perfect Union, and where he called Wright's sermon incendiary language and went on to say that his pastor's message expressed a profoundly distorted view of this country that sees white racism as endemic and elevates what is wrong with America above all that we know is right with America. And it goes on to say his response seemed to be designed to save his political career by presenting himself as a measured, reasoned man who loved America and did not believe that all white people were racist. And even though a lot of the people that I know who criticized this response went on, of course, to vote for him, I just remember having these conversations with people with, it just left a really bad taste in their mouths, where their feeling was, you had an opportunity to, not that you had to defend Reverend Wright because he could defend himself, but that here you had an opportunity to really talk about racism in America. And instead you sort of like, what was the word? This is, of course, their perceptions. You almost like, I hate to use the word, whitewashed it. Do you remember that speech? And do you remember your reaction?
I remember I think your understanding of a lot of Black people's responses is very accurate. And I probably had very much the same visceral reaction as you did, and a lot of other people did. But in the world of politics, and you are more versed in the world of politics than I am, I saw it as being what any politician running for an office like that would do. It was used. It was that scripture was weaponized. That sermon was weaponized against Barack Obama. I understand. I don't agree with it. I understand his response. In some ways, I don't know that he had a choice. I would have probably, if I were given where I stand today, with the benefit of whatever, a decade later, I probably would have been more nuanced in response. But I think his instincts were right, because had he basically defended the statement, "Goddamn America," he would have. But
there was more to. But there was more to that sermon than "Goddamn America."
Of course there was. But as the news media latched onto it, as the Republicans latched onto it, that was all you heard. If you go back and you read the speech or you listen to it, it has, the context is everything. But as you know, in political campaigns, context is trashed. It's the clip, and the clip of him saying "Goddamn America" didn't play well.
Yeah.
And if he had not basically come out with the speech he did, and again, as I said, should have been more nuanced. He himself should get more context. But you know what? That was talk about.
It was political survival. Yeah. It was political survival.
Yeah, and I can't say I blame, okay? In retrospect, I don't blame.
Yeah, I got that, and you know, of course, I went on to vote for him also because it was either him or you know the other guy.
The other guy,
the McCain. What I find interesting in the book, and even with conservative churches, conservative Black churches. You know, it talks about in the 20th century, Black preachers decried lynching, Jim Crow, segregation, police violence, and moral ills in America, and Martin Luther King's leadership in the civil rights movement. I remember in the 60s where, you know, there would be Jews, there would be Catholics, there'd be white churches that would march with Martin Luther King Jr. And I found that there was this moment where both Christians and Jews and Muslims saw the moral imperative of the fight against racism to be so important. And yet, I jump forward now to 2022, and it just, to listen to some of these so-called evangelical Christians basically espousing white nationalism, it's like, what happened between the 60s and now that we seem to have returned back to the role of religion, of certain religious sects, as defending an old order that we all thought had died. And I just, particularly this whole white nationalism, although they insist it's not white nationalism, it's the love of country. And I'm just wondering, what happened? What happened to this country? Because I thought that, you know, that moment in the 60s and to where we are now, where you see a return to that white churches of old.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay.
What's your opinion? You're Black, you should know.
That's right. That's what they pay me to do. They pay me to know these things. You know, if you look at it as being a continuum, it's only some churches, some white churches, and in those denominations, only some churches in those denominations came out. The Southern Baptists, certainly were not among the churches that were marching down Constitution Avenue in the March in Washington. I can guarantee you that. Southern Baptists and others were not. And even the Catholic Church, again, there were some priests and some nuns who followed their conscience and marched out. But there was, I would argue that was a minority. And you look at the Irish Catholics that were in Boston, Chicago. I mean, just to start with this. So let's start with that.
A reminder of reality.
Okay, let's just start. So but I think there's also a bigger thing to look at when the question you asked, which is, I remember during the March in Washington, a number of people, celebrities, people like Charleston Heston, who was very much into civil rights, you know, marching with civil rights leaders. And flash forward maybe 10, 15 years later, and Charleston Heston, and I used him because he was a leading proponent, had now gone suddenly full force right-wing, full-throated, my guns, full-throated, out
of my dead hands.
And it's like the statue, this whole thing about they've gone too far. I'm okay with giving them a vote. And again, look as a part of what's going on. Yeah. I believe as long as people would say, give Blacks, other minorities, the right to vote. Okay, give them that right to vote. That was something we can get behind. But when you start talking about, as King started talking about, two things that started turning off a lot of people. One is political power. Okay, and And that started coming out of King with two things. One was the war in Vietnam, and he lost a lot of followers when he started going against the war in Vietnam. But the other thing is, which gets often forgotten, a few years later, there was a march in Washington, Poor People's March.
Yes, 1969.
Yes, and King had, and that's 5 years, 6 years later. King had always preached about economic power. And if you look at the actual March on Washington for Jobs, and I think it was Jobs and Justice, I believe that's the full title of Washington. So he always kept that in mind about, he said that, what does it do to have a right to eat at a lunch counter if you don't have the money to pay for it? Okay.
Yes.
And so I maintain that a lot of people dropped out and from supporting civil rights when it came about economic rights, because part of what is in this country, and we get back to the role of our old boo capitalism, when people saw economic power, their jobs may be at stake. And what I mean by their jobs is, if the moment that you make equal opportunity a reality, that means some people are going to feel they lose out. Those are, and then you're seeing that carried on today. White males are, particularly those non-college educated white males, are looking at a loss of privilege, a loss of power of just having white skin. And that is a carry-on from, again, the March on Washington. And I think it answers in some respect your question.
Yeah. And before we move on to music, I've got to talk about this with that theme of economic power. There was always a discussion, what good, it's not only that we have the right to vote, that Black people have the right to vote, is that also they have the right to elect representatives, just like what happened during Reconstruction.
Right.
And I just remember that this whole theme of political power went hand in hand with economic power. And I just remember that I'm not sure which one scared people more, economic power or political power. Because I remember back in the 70s and the 80s, when you really started to see, particularly in the South, great numbers of Black representatives, how much that really blew people away. But even things like Stokely Carmichael talking about Black power, stop and think about that for a second. The words Black power had the same reaction as Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
Oh my God, Black Lives Matter. That must mean white lives don't matter. Black power, that must mean that they're going to take over. What, they're trying to take power away from white people? It was the same kind of hysteria. And with Stokely was back then named Stokely, but other people who used those words, Black power, was talking about that it was time to have power on their own, which has always been, under segregation, people who controlling their own economies, controlling their own political destiny in their communities. But this time it was about, hey, we need to have that same power, but on a bigger scale. We don't want to be just having have power in the Black community. Why can't we have power in Washington D.C. representing other mixed communities as well? I just it hit me now that same kind of hysteria over Black power.
Let me just add one thing. If you in the paragraph, there's a telling point, and this goes back to your thing about King was initially worried of the idea commenting in public that the slogan Black Power was an unwise choice.
Yes,
to
I remember that.
He described Black Power as a cry of pain. It is in fact a reaction to the failure of white power to deliver promises and to do it in a hurry. And here's what's, again, going back to what you said earlier, and sort of maybe we'll sort of wrap this up to some degree. You and I have had this discussion about how unwise the slogan of defund the police was.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you put defund the police and how the paranoia and the firestorm that created, and put that next to Black Power, it's the same thing. Okay,
thing.
and it again, maybe the wording can be used by your critics and your enemies to frame you in a way you don't want to be framed, or you should be framed. But at the same time, there's another side of that, and I maintain it. The other side of that is that it gets your people mobilized. It energizes them, and Black Power did that, and I think that defund the police did that. Yes, your critics and enemies are going to turn around and use it against you, but you know what? Your biggest issue is going to be mobilizing your supporters, and not forget the idiots. On the other side of the barricades.
Yeah, and I'm going to end this here, but I have to say that, and I was like this about the fun police, because I did criticize it, not because I'm against what it represented, but I thought that couldn't we have come up with something better? And of course, how do you come up with something that's snappy and slogan and all that stuff?
You want something you put in
the fewer words, the better. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 14 and music.
Yes.
And one of the things that about this, because this author shoves so much into this chapter. I mean, we went from Hitsville, USA, Motown Records, to talking about minstrel shows, to the white acceptance of Black music, or Black musicians and Black music. There was just so much shoved in here. But I want to, if I can for a second, focus on a couple of things. One is, I remember growing up in the 50s and 60s, where grew up in the Bronx, and I heard R&B everywhere. I mean, Motown was everything. I mean, you didn't have to be Black to listen to it. You
didn't have to be Jewish to buy Leaving Bread either.
Right? Yeah. I mean, you always have Puerto Rican, have Dominican. We listened to it. I mean, everybody listened to it, and yet there was this kind of if you went to the Ed Sullivan Show, look it up, folks. Very, very, very popular show, where you had mostly white performers. Even the American Bandstand with Dick Clark in those early years. So it was like America. It was very segregated. And then we won't even talk about Elvis Presley, where it wasn't really until the 60s where you started to see these Black performers on these shows that showcased predominantly white performers. But there was, and maybe you can speak to this, there was a practice in the 50s, excuse me, and Elvis Presley was a good example, but there was others, where music that originated, in some cases were written by Black musicians, were like, nobody heard them outside the Black radio stations, Black records, but were covered by white performers. And then suddenly they became popular. There was a song by Pat Boone, who I can't remember the
Tutti Frutti. He stole it from Tutti Frutti. He covered it from Little Richard.
Right,
Little Richard, which was Gray Being Bitter.
Yes. But that was in keeping with sort of the segregated nature, but it was also keeping with greed of there were white record companies who, how do we say, exploited those differences.
The way you say it, yeah.
Yeah. And Hitsville was, now we can all talk about our friend Barry Gordy, But at least Hitsville, Motown was an effort to level the playing field, so to speak.
Let me put it this way. Barry Gordy, and I am a Barry Gordy fan. He's a man that's flawed.
Yeah.
But Barry Gordy and Motown did what white record companies did. They exported their talent.
Yeah.
He was just happened to be a black exporter of black talent versus a white exporter of black talent. I mean, he used that in many ways as his business model. But, you know, again, were there no Barry Gordy, there probably would have continued, certainly for a lot longer, to be exploitation of black musicians by white companies.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just the history is notable. Music history is notable for the number of artists who were exploited. In fact, things like, you know, I can name you many. Chuck Berry might be the foremost one.
Yeah.
Who music was not only covered, but then somebody, a producer, would put their name on it. They would get the royalties, and the originator would not get anything. He would get paid. Yeah. And I can name legions of black writers, black entertainers who basically royalties were stolen from them by a producer who put his name on it instead of songwriters. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's that. I just want to say something about this this chapter. Wesley Morris, who wrote this chapter, yes, is a New York Times writer, and he's very perceptive. As a good writer, and I've enjoyed his writing. I was, though, profoundly disappointed with this chapter. You and I have discussed this, profoundly disappointed with the chapter. And I tried to figure out why. You know, and I guess the point I came to, and we can discuss this in greater detail, is one, considering how pivotal music has been in the Black experience, but not only in the Black experience, and how much it has been the American face to the world.
Yes, yes.
It's come through Black music, which sometimes had a Black face to it, and sometimes had a white face, but the background has been a Black person doing it. And I was just thought that this was, to me, shallow. And this is a man, Wesley Morris is not a shallow person. He's pretty profound. But where I realized that is in this chapter, 3 pages in, he gives a list. He basically lists a list of Black entertainers, just page, the whole page, and
no context.
No context. I mean, and then I read on, and he calls out a number of other, people who going back to day, and again, given the weight that music plays in this country and in the world and in the Black community, I thought it was really pretty damn shallow. And I think I've said that. I'm repeating to myself on that. But
yeah, I do want to give him a little bit of, there's a paragraph in here that I really want to read because this sort of sums it up. Because I thought he spent quite a bit of time talking about minstrel shows. Mm-hmm. And I understand why. It's just I thought it was kind of odd that he spent so much time on it in the context of Black music. Yeah. But there is a paragraph that I thought was really very powerful. And that was where he talks about African Americans make up 13% of the population, yet account for an incalculable amount of what moves us and how we move. The last 20 years of Billboard year-end charts teem with soul music and hip-hop innovations. Black choreography often starts the dance crazes that sweep TikTok's 100 million plus active American users. And then he goes on to talk about decades of jams written, produced, and performed by Black artists sustain parties in places that sustain no actual Black people. This increasing eruption of ingenuity, invention, intuition, improvisation constitutes the very core of American culture. Now, of that entire paragraph, what I thought was the most important part is that last line about American culture. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because I've been on this whole thing recently about what defines Americans, an American. When I say American, I mean an all-encompassing word of American in terms of culture. Because there's another line where he talks about that for many, Blackness has been made incompatible with Americanness. Mm-hmm. That somehow we have this parallel, which you could understand the concepts of segregation, white culture, Black culture. But over the years, where things have begun to meld, and you find music, whether it's music, sports, even intellectual endeavors, politics, you see this big part of our culture become defined as American culture. And I have this issue of relating to Latino, mm-hmm. Latinx, whatever, mm-hmm. whoever the hell we are, that we've got to begin to look at ourselves as, we just have much a right to be called American, again, in the cultural sense, and in the political sense, and all the other sense, because there are too many people in this country who are like, that's like, it just jumped into my head. A few years back, I remember there was a news that salsa had overtaken ketchup mm-hmm. as the main condiment in America, and how people just went crazy. It's like, no, I put ketchup on everything. But the facts were that people use salsa in many, chips, and it's like, now, of course, we can debate whether that's real salsa. But you know what I'm saying? It's like this idea of like what defines American culture. And I just keep coming back to this, like, even today, we separate certain Black music categories. I mean, look how long it took for rap music to be accepted at the Grammys, and even to this day, there's, I can get Beyonce, I forget what, I don't have it in front of me, the lines where they talk about Beyonce and all her, in those first few years. And she always won in the R&B categories, but not in the pop categories. Because why? So anyway, I just had to throw that out because I just thought that was an important, really, one of the very few things I found about this chapter, really important.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, you covered a lot of ground in your last statement.
Sorry about that.
a lot of ground. I mean, the minstrel thing I thought was, yes, basically overdone in the sense that, hey, you black up your face, and you come out and pretend to be somebody else. That's bad. And you can probably pretty much leave it there. Okay, we've gone past that. We all acknowledge that was really bad. What was, to me, I wanted to see more of, and in this, and he touched on, is that music is marketed. Who it's marketed to, and the categories where they're marketed to. That's where you get the biases come into. Because every category is a part of marketing. It has very little to do with creativity, very little to do with art. I remember very distinctly when I was living in New York and working in ad agencies, hip hop, which wasn't called hip hop, that was called rap, was like considered like, it wasn't even considered music.
Yes.
And the music industry itself treated rap that way. And hip hop became a nice way of saying rap in a lot of ways. And then, of course, we flash forward, there's many types of hip hop, many types of rap. You broke it down. Once again, that's a way of marketing it. But country music is a classic example of how racism works in the music industry. Country music, in its early days, many of the performers were Black. It has, but again, it was not seemly to market those people as part of country music. So those people were not only were shifted off to the side. And I remember,
well, it wasn't. By the way, in the early days, it wasn't even called country. It was country western.
Of course,
it was called country western, and it was specifically targeting, Southern, Appalachian, Texas, those Western states. So because it was like, listen, if you go to the country museum in Nashville, they have now it's been some years since I've been there, but they have a display, and it's a tree. Well, it's a display of a tree, not a real tree, where it talks about the roots of modern day country music and the offshoots, beginning with Appalachia. But what's in there is the blues.
Yeah, of course.
What's in there is jazz. What's in there is a lot of Black music.
Yeah, but it's also true, and this is what is erased, that a number of the early country, in that quotation,
yes,
were Blacks. There is, that's not just jazz having influence. That's not just blues having influence. It is that there were performers who were Black who were country. And you can talk about Charlie Pride, but Charlie Pride became the best known example of that. There are others. One could argue that, for example, Lightning Hopkins was a country singer. He was marketed as blues, but when you listen to stuff and you compare next to a number of the early practitioners of country, there's very little different other than the skin color. Okay?
Right.
And the thing that gets me too about a lot of this stuff is, they make these separations. When you get to many rural areas, it's hard to detect the differences in culture between Black culture or Black Southern culture and white Southern culture. Okay.
Yes.
And in Appalachia, there were Blacks living in Appalachia. Big secret.
I know.
Okay.
I know.
They were playing. In fact, the banjo, which is a mainstay of country music, came from Africa and was adopted from African musicians.
Yes.
So and the falsetto singing, again, one can pinpoint that back from Africa. I'm not trying to say that this one group is superior to the other group. I am saying that we have in this country seen it to our advantage to whitewash certain things to make them more palatable, more marketable to what we perceive as being a mainstream audience, which we perceive as being predominantly white.
Yeah. And I always find it, since we just talked about the churches, gospel music and the role of gospel, not only in the churches, but when they began to become more of a mainstream, and you started to see, you see these annual gospel performances. I hate to use the word, they're not tournaments or competitions, but you start to see white gospel, as well as Black gospel. So there's a lot of again, this kind of, I don't want to say blending, but it is, as time has gone on and you see white performers doing what we would call blue-eyed soul, or
which is an unfortunate name.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry, but that's how it's been described. And you get to a point where music sort of begins to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like, it's hard to put it into a category. But what I keep seeing is, it's like this idea of like, well, what is it really if a Black singer does it versus a white singer? And we seem to this day, I think, sort of go, it's easier for a white singer to get away with singing what we would like to call soul music and raise that person up versus someone who's been doing it for a very long time. But anyway, I'm digressing here. Any last thoughts on music?
Yeah, just, a couple of things. One, the comment about music or culture, let's just say culture in a whole, being representative of a country and is what is used by countries. Let's just recall that there's something called soft power, diplomatic soft power. This country has used it very well to promote itself, promote its policies. And this country has used Black culture to do that. And particularly during the Cold War, one thing stands out is that the State Department sent a number of jazz musicians, blues musicians around the world to promote America's policies. But the one thing I think that we shouldn't overlook is that one of the problems that people have today is that they don't want to see that representation. And they don't, because they see it as being, again, it's again, and I'll use this pretty directly. There are a number of whites that look at that as being a loss of somehow or another, their privilege, their influence. It's why this whole thing about replacement theory fits into that. Our culture is being replaced. We're being replaced. Our political power is, but it's what has propelled people like Donald Trump to have this place in America, because he's fed on that. There are fear, and the fear comes from his demographics.
Yeah. But as they sit down to eat their tacos and their mac and cheese and those southern ribs at that black barbecue.
But isn't that what, frankly, isn't that what makes this country particularly, isn't that diversity what makes this country interesting, makes this country powerful?
Yes, but that's what I'm saying. The hypocrisy of it just, kills me.
Anyway,
all right. We're going to finish with music there. And
can we go out with maybe James Brown in the background, a little Aretha?
Yeah, we'll put some James Brown back
put
there.
That on there so we can.
Or I don't know. I think I'm supposed to play some Beyonce or something. Listen, I'm realizing how old I am when I listen to some of the music today. So we're going to do, when we come back, we finish church and we finish music. And when we come back, we're going to talk about, what are we going to talk about? Healthcare. Right. Which is going to be interesting because we talked about medicine in the other chapter, and we'll see how much of an overlap there is. All right, sir. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you soon on the next edition of the 1619 Project Podcast.
Yes.